firing had gotten so intense, it was just breaking rice straws off in front of our faces. You could hear the bullets pop in the air all around you. I'm from Yoakum, Texas, originally, born and raised there. Graduated from Yoakum High School in 1966. After I got out of the service, I went to Baytown, where I've been ever since. Growing up, my family was in the trucking business. My father and my uncle were partners in the trucking business, and at the time I got drafted, they were running 12 trucks, and I was a truck driver, quote, mechanic, oil drainer, flat fixer, whatever. During the summers, I would be driving a truck. Sometimes during the school year, if we had drivers sick or whatever, then I would drive. I started driving for my dad when I by myself in an 18-wheeler for when I was age 15, and I drove until I got drafted into the Army. I grew up on 300 acres. It was rough in that we all worked. We had to work, and we worked hard. We planted and grew our own food. Rather, we raised our own cattle. We raised our own hogs, chickens, everything you can imagine that would have to do with a farm. But yet, I had 300 acres to run around with, and I hunted and fished every second that I had.
Don, you were drafted into the military. How did you find out, and what was your reaction to being drafted?
Drafted, I was driving a truck, and I remember my truck had broken down in Brenham, Texas, and I called home to have someone come and repair the truck. And at that time, my uncle told me, he said, "Well, you really don't need to worry about it." He said, "You're in the Army now." He said, "Your draft notice just came in the mail." So that made me feel great, and instant butterflies, and like, oh no, here we go. I was drafted October 1966. I took basic training in Fort Hood, Texas. A very unlikely place to take basic training if you know you're going to Vietnam, but that's where we took it. Our training in Fort Hood was pretty unique. They knew that we were going to Vietnam the minute we got to Fort Hood. They never said that to us at first, but they trained us hard. We were in pretty good shape by the time we got out of basic training. I can honestly say that it was a lot different than what I understand that the Army or the Marines or other branches of service are like now. Now they can't lay a hand on you, but I remember getting hit by a drill sergeant. I remember a guy getting kicked in the rear pretty hard by one of his drill sergeants in the other platoon, and they were pretty rough.
What were some humorous events that happened during training?
There's always something, some good and some bad in every situation. And I remember we had a guy named Jack Hutton that was really overweight. He was a big red-headed guy from Schenectady, New York. He was way overweight, and in order to get to eat, you had to do 10 pull-ups or 20 push-ups, or you didn't eat. And I remember it seems like Jack went about 3 or 4 weeks without eating because he couldn't do one of any of them. And finally, after missing so many meals, they had let him come in and eat. And finally, he got where he could do 1 or 2 of each one of the exercises. And pretty soon he could do 5 or 6. And by the time basic was over, he had lost down to about 180 pounds from about 300. He felt great, looked great, and was really proud of himself. And we were all proud of him. And that's one of the things that I remember that really meant a lot to us. And we hurt for him because we knew that he had really suffered, because I've seen him be so hungry he would cry. Now, they can't do that to you in these days, but they did it to us then. They wanted us in shape. They knew we were going to war. Had a guy named Walraven from I think it was Marietta, Georgia. It was in Georgia, and he was a good kid. And Corporal McDormand loved to mess with him, and he just loved the way Walraven sound because the guys from Georgia and Texas all had kind of a drawl, and Corporal McDormand would say Walraven. He'd say, "Here, Corporal," and a couple of seconds later he'd say, "Walraven, here, Corporal. Walraven, here, Corporal." And he did it so often that when you came into the barracks at night, if he was asleep, you could go Walraven, and in his sound asleep, he would go, "Here, Corporal." And so everybody took advantage of that, and the poor guy, everybody would do that all night long. If they were on fire watch, they'd go when they'd change watches with another fire watch. Before they started their shift, they'd go, "Walraven, here, Corporal," and it was pretty funny. In basic, they guaranteed us 4 hours of sleep out of 24. But what they didn't tell us is they could give it to us in 30-minute increments. And a lot of times that's just what they did. They would wake us up 30 minutes and have a surprise inspection, or they would make us take our foot lockers out in the street. Sometimes we would have to fall out in our underwear carrying our foot lockers, and they'd make us empty them out and then pick it back up, bring it back in the barracks, get it rearranged, and have another inspection. And that went on for weeks. And it got to where we were just kind of numb from exhaustion and so forth. But there came a certain point where they started building us back up. So it was pretty interesting, pretty tough.
When were you assigned to Alpha Company, 1st of the 6th Infantry?
I went to A Company, 1st of the 6th, after AIT. I took basic in C Company, 1st of the 46th, stayed with them through AIT. We formed 1st of the 6th Infantry, which became one of the battalions in the 198th Infantry Brigade, which was formed in Fort Hood for the purpose of going to Vietnam. And that must have been, let's see, we took basic in October. We took AIT probably in January. They got probably around the 1st of January or the middle of January. And then sometimes March, I think, we went over to the 1st of the 6th and formed the Gunfighters. We developed a pretty unique bond with each other when we were in training. We spent a lot of time with each other. We were in the field working 5 days a week, running, playing Army games, doing mock attacks, and so forth. And you become real close whenever you live in a foxhole with somebody 5 days a week, week in and week out. You eat together, you use the bathroom together, you suffer together, you get tired together, you stink together when you're in a foxhole and you haven't had a bath in 3 or 4 days, and you fight together. I mean, I've seen some pretty hefty fights, but it's just like having 3 or 4 boys in a family. You know, they're going to fight, but yet if somebody else messed with you, they were in trouble. So you really become a real close family in a situation like we had.
Tell us what it was like receiving orders for Vietnam.
When we found out that we were going to Vietnam, it was not really a shock and not really a surprise, but yet you're never ready to hear that you're fixing to be deployed to a war zone. And I remember the first sergeant came out and he said, "I regret to inform you that you will be deployed to points unknown in a southeastern Asian country in Southeast Asia." And of course, that's like saying you're going to South Texas, to the biggest city in South Texas, but I can't tell you the name. And we knew where we were going, even though he didn't tell us exactly. We only prayed we were going to Korea, but we knew better. So it was quite a shock. Most of us accepted it. Most of us, when we got drafted, knew that we were headed for Vietnam. And back then, And I know that there's still people like this, but most of us were raised in this country where if your country called, you answered the call and you did it to the best of your ability. The family was kind of like the kids they raised. My stepdad had been in the military. He had been in Fort Hood during the Korean War, training troops, and then he stayed in the reserves. So he had raised me to accept it when it came my turn to serve. And my mother understood that also, even though it worried her and it scared her. I think deep down in her heart, she was proud to know that her son would go do what he had to do. And that's kind of the way that they grew up being themselves. And my brothers and sisters, I remember my two sisters were proud but yet concerned, and my two little brothers could have cared less because they were a lot younger than me.
I know your unit traveled to Vietnam by ship. What was that experience like?
Most people that went to Vietnam went as replacements and would go over on an airplane. They would send a group of 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 or whatever, and they would go into some unit as replacements. But because we were a newly formed brigade, and they were reactivating the Americal Division, which is the old 23rd Division, almost all of us went on two ships, the USS Upshur, which we call the USS Upchuck, and the USS Gordon. I think the first of the 52nd was on the USS Gordon, and first of the 6 and part of the first of the 46 were on the Upshur. So we had a long boat ride. Well, the Upshur was a typical troop carrier. It was hot. It was crowded. The bunks were all hung one below another, and they were real close together. Uh, I thought the bunks were great because you were always kind of swaying like being in a hammock. Some of the guys just couldn't stand the constant motion, and it made them sick. So I started off on the bottom bunk. I never got sick, but everybody above me did. So I ended up on the top bunk in my particular row, and all I remember is down in our compartment, it smelled like vomit because everybody there was sick. There was 3 or 4 of us that didn't get sick, and so we were on mop detail constantly cleaning up vomit. And one of the things that I remember about that just tickles me to death, and I don't know why I thought it was funny, but it was. We were watching a movie one night, and I think the movie was Texas Across the River, which is really a hilarious movie. And we were sitting in this room. It was real crowded, and we would sit on the floor, spread our legs, and then another guy would sit between our legs, and then another one between his legs. And right out in the middle of this large group of guys, somebody threw up, and it was a chain reaction. And pretty soon, everybody was slipping and sliding in the vomit, and they were just falling all over each other, and people trying to get up, and everybody throwing up. And I was kind of on the outer edges, and it just was the funniest thing I had ever seen. And I really enjoyed it.
What were your thoughts about arriving in Vietnam?
When we arrived in Vietnam, it was a pretty scary situation. We pulled up into Da Nang Harbor, and it hit us all of a sudden. We were out on the decks and everything, and it just all of a sudden hit us. Hey, we're in a war zone, and we're fixing to be fighting. And it was a pretty lonesome. I had just gotten married before I went over there, and all of a sudden I was sick to my stomach because I was scared, lonesome, homesick, in love, and in the wrong place. When we disembarked the ship, we thought that we would get off the ship fighting. Well, nothing could have been farther from the truth. But we landed in Da Nang Harbor. They loaded us up on LSTs and moved us down south, a little further south to Chu Lai, where we came out of the inside of the LST, which was filled with rust and it was filthy. It was hot. Uh, we changed clothes to have our good fatigues on, and we thought we might get out fighting or at least shooting or possibly be under attack. But when they opened the ramp, there was the U.S. Army band that's standing there on the dock. General Westmoreland met us there on the ramp, and so we came out on a parade with the band playing, and what a surprise!
What were your first assignments after you arrived in Vietnam?
When we landed in Vietnam, our first assignment was actually about a week of uh, refreshing courses and training courses on mines and booby traps that we took right there in July, and then they loaded us on trucks and moved us down south of July to Duck Pho, and we landed on a base camp in Duck Pho, and they divided us up. And our first assignment was bridge security, and they sent us parts of the platoons to several different bridges, and that's what we did the first week or so on the bridges. We thought we were in good shape when we went to when we got through with our training at Fort Hood. We thought we were just about as good a shape as we could get because all we did was run up and down the hills in Fort Hood, and I carried a 90 millimeter recoilless rifle, which was heavy, and so I thought, well, you can't get in much better shape than I'm in. But when we got to Vietnam and we didn't get any sleep, all of a sudden we're carrying live ammunition, we're carrying food on us and everything, and the weight that we carried would vary from 75 to 100 pounds, depending on what all you had to take and how much food you had to take, depending on how long your mission was or how much ammunition you wanted to carry. And I remember about probably the end of the first week, I thought I would die from exhaustion. I literally felt like my system couldn't handle anymore. Then all of a sudden, one day I woke up and after a couple hours sleep, and I actually felt pretty good. And that's when I knew that I was going to probably make it if somebody didn't shoot me. The monsoons over there were miserable. Uh, I remember the first operation we went out on lasted about a week. And again, we weren't in very good shape like we thought we were. So everybody took their poncho. When it's rolled up, it only weighs a couple of pounds. But after that week, we thought, man, we're not going to take anything that we don't need because it's hot over here. So we all left our ponchos back in the rear when we went on our next assignment. And the second day is when the monsoons hit. We didn't know they were going to come, but we were out in the jungle for almost 30 days without a poncho. And that was an experience that we never forgot. And from that point on, we never left our ponchos back in the rear area. One time we went 3.5 days without eating, uh, simply because it was we were up in some mountains or down in some valleys, and the monsoons had set in, and the fog was heavy, and you couldn't see the mountaintops, so the helicopters couldn't get in to resupply us. We went about 3.5 days without eating, and whenever you weigh 150 pounds and you're carrying 100 pounds of weight on you, and you're not eating anything, there's not much for your body to work on. And we were desperate. We finally crawled on top, climbed up a mountain, and got on top of it where the helicopters could find us, and they brought a hot meal out to us. And we thought that we would be able to eat 2 or 3 steaks, and everybody was complaining because they gave us a little bitty piece of steak and one spoonful of English peas and one spoonful of mashed potatoes with gravy, and we were all hollering at them, we were starving. And they told us if you can eat all that, you can have more, all you want, but eat that first. And hardly anybody could finish that plate because our stomachs had shrunk up so much.
You said the company was a tight knit unit. Tell us about the leadership.
Our leadership in A Company was some of the best, I believe, that existed in Vietnam. We had a captain that was tough. He was a good guy. He was fair. He believed in men being in shape. He had a purpose. He somehow managed to keep our morale up better than any company over there. And what he did before we left is he rounded out his company with the best possible cadre he could find, and he went around Fort Hood locating people that he had heard about or that he had read about or whatever that had already been to Vietnam and was willing to go back. So he sent us back with platoon sergeants and some squad leaders that had experience in combat. And so I believe that we had one of the best managed and best commanded companies in Vietnam. And Captain Brennan named our company the Gunfighters before we ever left Fort Hood. And we actually earned a pretty good reputation in Vietnam.
Sergeant Bartley was highly respected by the men, including all the officers. He served as your platoon sergeant. What do you remember about him?
Sergeant Bartley was one of the best leaders, non-commissioned officer leaders that we had. He was a Sergeant E5 when we left Fort Hood, but he had come to us from the 1st Cav, where he had just spent a year in Vietnam and he had been wounded and so forth. And so then he decided he'd go back with us, and he had met Captain Brennan somewhere, and Captain Brennan decided to ask him to come back with us, and he accepted. And he was probably the ultimate soldier. He looked like a soldier. He acted like a soldier. He wasn't particularly what you'd call gun-ho. It's just his job and his mission was to kill the enemy. And he did it very methodically, and he did it very businesslike. He didn't believe in molesting bodies once they were dead. He didn't believe in harassing unnecessarily the people. He believed that if they were enemy and you knew they were enemy, kill your enemy and leave him alone. Get his belongings for intelligence purpose and leave the body. He was so in tune with being in a war zone or being in the woods or in the jungle. I always tell people he's the only man I ever knew that went through the monsoons and never got wet. And he was just a unique person. And Sergeant Bartley, had he not been there with us, I believe we would have lost a lot more men. He and Sergeant Burks were extraordinarily good and just great leaders.
What were your first firefights like?
When we first got to Vietnam, like I said, we went on bridge security, and we had our first little fight there on the bridges. They attacked us at night. One night they came through the water and started shooting at us. And that was the 7th night we were in Vietnam. And that night my squad leader got killed. And of course that put the fear in us. That's when we realized that we were truly in a war zone. And I think every one of us, without doubt, probably were thinking to themselves, I want to go home now. And it was a shock to lose one of our guys. And I thought it was pretty pathetic that it had to be my squad leader. And on the 7th day we were there. And we really didn't get into a lot of heavy firefights the first couple of months we were there. We got sniped at a lot. A couple of times we got pinned down by several snipers, and that's scary because you don't know where it's coming from. I remember one particular sniper had me and Martinez down in this rice paddy, and he kept shooting at us, and we could hear his weapon operating, but we couldn't find him. He was in the sugar cane, and he kept shooting, and he would miss us by a foot or two. And finally, we just started laughing. Every time he'd fire, he'd miss us a little bit. And it dawned on me, we must be hysterical. We're laying out here with some fool shooting at us, and we're laying here laughing. And so I told Martinez, I said, man, let's get out of here. So we jumped up and ran. But we didn't get into a lot of firefights. It started increasing and elevating as we got closer to the TET offensive.
On February 8, 1968, the gunfighters were changed forever when the company was overrun south of Da Nang at the village of Lo Giang. Would you share your memories about the day leading up to the battle and how the battle unfolded from your perspective?
We had come in out of the field off of a fairly long 3 or 4 week operation out in the jungle, and we thought we were going to get 2 or 3 days stand down to be able to shower and clean up and clean weapons and just lay around, play cards and relax and eat hot food and just have a pretty good time. And I'd gotten a shower, and a bunch of guys had gotten a shower, and I went and got clean clothes before I did anything else. But about half the company hadn't made it to the showers yet, and all of a sudden the word came down that we were fixing to leave again, that everybody had to go get fresh ammo and get ready, get their field gear ready to go. And we had like 45 minutes to an hour to get everything together to meet on the helipad for departure to areas unknown to us. So we went down to the helipad, and we sat down there about seemed like several hours. And I remember when we were sitting, when you're sitting on the helipad waiting for the chopper to come in to pick you up, you get pretty bored. And I remember Turner was sitting there, Philip Turner. He was my machine gunner, and he had a green, one of those locust type grasshoppers on his fatigues. And he said, I'm going to give this thing 10 seconds to get off of my leg, or I'm going to eat him. And we all started counting down. So when he hit 0, he just picked him up and put him in his mouth and started crunching and munching. So finally the chopper got there. They loaded the whole company up on a Chinook. And we still didn't know where we were going. We just knew we were going north, and there were so many things going on at that time that any place we went was probably going to be bad. The rumor got out that we were going to Quezon to help relieve the Marines up there. They had been under siege for several, like a couple of months already, and they were taking a beating. So we went on the Chinook, and it seemed like we flew for hours and hours, and I'm sure it was a couple of hours. And we landed in Da Nang, south of Da Nang, at an old Marine base camp. And so they told us to go ahead and set up for the evening. It was just before dark. So everybody started preparing their evening meal and kind of relaxing and everything. And then we got an order for all squad leaders and team leaders to meet at the company. We went up there, and we got the shocking news that we would be moving out that night, and we would be walking several miles in the night, which is something a big unit hardly ever does, is move at night. We left this old Marine base camp, and we started walking down this railroad track, and it was kind of a high berm, and the track itself had been torn out, but you could still tell that it was a railroad track. Someone hadn't told the ARVNs, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese soldiers, that we were coming. So they opened up on us with a 50 caliber machine gun. And Sergeant Burks asked for a green star cluster flare to fire to show that we were friendly forces. But somebody handed him a red one, and he fired that, and that marks an enemy position. So, boy, they really opened up on us then. And luckily, the berm was high enough to where they didn't kill anybody or hit anybody. And finally, we were able to get through on a radio to someone who put a stop to the firing. And so we were able to go on from there to this close to this old graveyard where we spent the remainder of the night. It must have been about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And normally we would dig a foxhole and take precautionary measures, but everybody was so exhausted, and we knew we were only going to have a few hours to sleep. Everybody just kind of laid out in defensive positions and slept on the top of the ground, and got our 2 or 3 hours sleep, and then it gradually became daylight. When we woke up, that was the morning of February the 8th. We started almost immediately at daylight. We started receiving a round over our head. A sniper would pop around a good ways over our head. You can kind of tell the way it breaks air, whether it's close to you or not. And we would get one every 10 minutes or so, one round. And then after about 30 minutes, we'd start getting a couple of rounds. And they were pretty high. And then it got a little heavier. We would start getting one just every couple of minutes, and then 2 or 3 every couple of minutes. And at one point, Captain Brennan made this statement. He said, if we get one more round, he said, we're getting online and we're going over to that village, which was Lo Giang, and we're going to kill or capture some snipers. So at that point, we went online. After we got another round, we went online. Second platoon to the left, third platoon to the right, first platoon back in the tree line behind us. They weren't to. They were to stay there for security reasons, and the mortar platoon was right behind them. So we started moving out on line, the two platoons, toward a village called Lo Giang, named Lo Giang. And there was about a 400 to 600 meter wide rice paddy that we had to go through to get to that village. And I remember when we first took off from that graveyard night logger position, there was a cobra that had ran out in front of Captain Brennan and some of us on the right side. And I mean, he was boogieing. He was really going. And I remember Captain Brennan and Sergeant Burks tried to shoot at him, and I don't know if they hit him. I'm sure they didn't because he just it just accelerated that much more, and he got out. I don't know what happened to the snake. So we stayed on line, and we got out. We got out about 100 yards, and I noticed that the sniping had really gotten a lot heavier, and it got to the point where it was more than sniping, and it started getting pretty intense. And after we had gone out about maybe 200 yards, it really got bad. So Captain Brennan, well, maybe we were out about 300 or 400 yards, and Captain Brennan told us all to get down behind this rice dike. Well, my squad leader had gone out in front of us, uh, and we got down, and Sergeant Captain Brennan was calling for airstrikes or calling for support and trying to figure out what was going on because no one had told us that there was a North Vietnamese battalion in front of us. They knew it, but no one had given us a word. So he's trying to figure out what was going on, and he requested helicopter support. And he popped a green smoke grenade and threw it behind him to mark our position so they wouldn't strafe us or hit us. And when he did that, the North Vietnamese put the smoke grenade out with a mortar. They dropped a mortar right on top of the smoke, and Lieutenant Swank was there with Captain Brennan. Lieutenant Swank was the artillery FO, and he started trying to get a fire mission coming from the artillery. And about that time, the firing had intensified to a point where we it was unbelievable. And all of a sudden, I realized that they had machine guns set up on the corners of the rice paddy, and the firing was just above the tops of the rice dikes. And so we were all down behind the rice dikes, and my squad leader had just gone down like he had been hit. Well, he was out about 10 yards in front of the rice dike. And so I thought he had been shot. So I told somebody to go get him because I was the A team leader. And everybody just looked at me because we were all kind of in shock. So the medic and I got up and went out and picked him up. But just before we picked him up, we tried to find a wound, and we couldn't find a wound on him anywhere. So we picked him up and brought him back behind the rice dike. Well, when we bent over to pick him up, all of a sudden the medic, a bullet came between his lips and clipped the left front tooth out of his mouth. And I remember he hollered and he had this shock, this look, this total surprise on his face. And he said, "Oh man, they just shot my tooth out." And I remember looking at him thinking, "Man, this is getting serious." And so we dropped the sergeant behind the rice dike, and we were working on him when Captain Brennan told us to pull back. And the firing had gotten so intense, it was just breaking rice straws off in front of our faces, and you could hear the bullets pop in the air all around you. I felt bullets hitting my clothes, and so Captain Brennan told us to pull back. And I told him that we couldn't pull back, that we had wounded men out there that we had to attend to. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was wounded, and that was the reason. Well, and he had seen something I hadn't seen, and that he knew that there was probably 1,000 troops headed toward us. They had come up out of a trench and attacked us, and I was busy working on this wounded man and hadn't seen that yet. But I could tell by the firing that it was so bad. Captain Brennan, whom we all highly respected, had told us again, you got to pull back. And I still didn't know that he was wounded. And then about that time, his RTO was hit. And I remember him screaming so bad, and just it drove me crazy. I mean, he was hurting and he was scared, and he knew Captain Brennan was having to pull back, and he thought Captain Brennan was going to leave him out there. And I remember him begging him not to leave him. And we were working on my squad leader to get him back to the rear, and so we decided rather than stay there. At first, I was going to stay there. We were going to stay there, me and my squad, with this wounded man, and just fight it out right there and die if we must. But when I realized that it was far more serious than I first thought, and I started hearing other people scream and as they were getting hit and either dying or just being wounded, I decided we needed to pull this man back to the graveyard that we had spent the night at the night before. So myself and Smize, Sheridan, the medic, and Polino started pulling him back, and we were in heavy, sloppy mud, and it was almost impossible to pull him through the mud. But we were doing that, and at some point, I remember the whole world just kind of going red, and I felt this searing pain in front of my head, and I remember just going out, and I realized I'd just gotten hit, and a bullet had gone through the front of my helmet and whacked me on the head right in the middle of my forehead pretty hard and knocked me out. And well, it did knock me out at first, but about 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes after I got hit, I was just rolling around out there bleeding. A mortar hit close to me, and it kind of flipped me around, and all of a sudden I couldn't see anything. And I put my hand up on the corner of my head. I had a real bad pain up here, and all I could feel was goo coming out of my head, and I couldn't see anything out of my right eye, and I thought the corner of my head was missing. And when I thought that, I started letting the whole world know I'd been hit, like some of the other guys were doing. And after a few minutes of that, my eyes started clearing up, and I kept putting my hand back up here, and all it was the mortar had blown mud into my eye, and I had mud all over my face, and the bleeding mixed with the mud just felt like my brains hanging out. I remember I was getting sick because I lost so much blood and had a tremendous concussion, and I don't remember a whole lot about what I did other than I kept crawling around out there and without any direction. And I remember three guys. There was a guy named Holloway, a guy named Johnson, and I believe Avant had crawled out there to put a bandage on my head and to get me turned around back to the right direction, going back to the rear. I remember at one point, I remember Captain Brennan calling for air support, and I couldn't distinguish everything that was being said because there was so much noise from all the firing. But I remember for the first time ever hearing him break radio procedure. He wanted air support, and he wanted it right now. And he didn't care about procedure, and all he wanted was air support. And it made me feel good that he was asserting his authority to the people above him. And but it also scared me that he was having trouble getting somebody to respond to him. And it finally had just gotten so intense that it was unbelievable the amount of bullets that were coming, and you just felt any second you were going to feel your brain just go blank, and or your half of your body get torn apart. And it was the most horrible, horrifying experience I've ever been in my life. For the first time in my life, I remember praying uh, so strong. I prayed and prayed. As I crawled around out there, I remember 2 or 3 different times people would head me back the right direction, and I'd get turned around. I remember at one point I found Polino. He was hiding behind rice dyke, and he didn't have a shirt on. And I was wounded, and he said, "Hey Don," he said, "Man, I got shot in the back. How bad is it?" And he just had a thin red line close to his backbone. And I said, "Well, you hadn't been shot." I said, "Something just kind of cut your skin." I said, "It's just a scratch." And he said, "Man, it hurts too bad to be just a scratch." And I said, "Well, it probably just clipped your bone, through your skin there, and it's a glancing shot." And as it turned out, when he got to the hospital, he had an AK-47 round laying against his spine, and or so close to his spine they didn't take it out for fear of damaging his spine. And I think it's still in there to this day. I remember at one point I was so confused and everything, and I remember crawling along, and Jim Brewer with the weapons platoon had been our FO for my platoon. And he had been shot, and we were both crawling back toward the graveyard. He had his radio on his back, and the antenna was sticking straight up through that rice. The rice was about 3 foot high, and we were crawling along there parallel, probably 10 yards apart. And I remember Lieutenant Wendover calling him on the radio, and of course they weren't using proper radio procedure anymore because it didn't matter. And I heard him say, "Hey Brewer, who is that behind you?" And I remember Brewer was crying, and he said, "I don't know, sir." He said, "I'm hit. I can't turn around." And he said, "Brewer, you got to turn around." He said, "There's somebody behind you. I need to know who it is." And I remember Brewer saying, "Oh my God, it's the Gooks." And I turned around and looked, and there was about 5 of them that were about 5 meters behind Brewer and I. They were duck walking through the rice paddy, and they were following his radio antenna. And I remember Brewer saying, "Oh my God, it's the Gooks." And Lieutenant Wendover said, "Y'all get down." And they fired over the top of us, and they fired a law into that group of North Vietnamese soldiers and killed all of them. And rice paddies, they always, at a certain growing point, they're flooded with water. And those rice paddies have fish living in them. And they have all these sucker fish. They look almost like an eel. They're round and they're really pretty ugly, but they're actually fish. And as I was crawling along, this blood was just running out of my head, and a lot of it was coagulating. And I remember, uh, you know, I was so goofy, I just couldn't really figure out what was going on. And I remember these fish were fighting over my blood, and I remember having kind of a illusion, not hallucination that these fish were getting bigger and bigger, and they were jumping out of the water, catching my blood as it was stringing down. And all of a sudden, they became bigger, and they started looking like alligators, and they were just going crazy over that blood. And I remember it just seemed like big alligators were jumping out of the water trying to bite my head off, and all they, I realize now that they were just after the blood, and they probably wasn't more than 6 or 8 inches long at the most, these sucker fish. But I remember it just really horrified my mind to see these fish fighting over my blood. It was like they were going to eat me. At one point, right after I found Polino out there, we were laying behind this rice dyke, and he had a 45 pistol in his hand, but you couldn't tell what it was. It was just a big ball of mud. And I remember it was kind of funny. He said, "Donnie, you think I ought to shoot this pistol?" And I told him, I said, "Let me get out of the way before you do, because that thing's going to blow up if you fire it," because it was full of mud. He, I passed out, obviously. I mean, I was unconscious, and he saw the North Vietnamese soldiers coming at him, and he played dead. And they searched his body, and they thought I was dead, so they searched my body, and they took my dog tags, and they took my letters. I had letters sealed up in a plastic bag that I carried in my fatigue pants pocket. I had maps. I had my little New Testament Bible in my chest pocket, and they took all of that stuff, and I didn't even realize it. And after I got into the hospital and spent a month there and went back to the unit, First Sergeant Rodriguez came up to me a day or two after I got back to the unit and gave me a package with all those letters and stuff in it. And he told me, here's some stuff we found in a cave about 2 miles from where y'all got hit. And so they had searched me and pulled all that stuff off my body and took it with them, and they got it to that cave where our guys found it a couple of days later. That's a pretty scary thought, knowing that I was, because they had been capturing some of our guys and tying them up and trying to drag them out of the rice paddy. And when we started getting air support in, they knew they couldn't get the prisoners out. Shot them in the back of the head with their own 45, with our men's own 45, and executed them in the field, and left them there tied up without their boots on and all their equipment off of them. There were a lot of enemy that came out of that village. They had uniforms. They weren't Viet Cong. They had uniforms. There were some Chinese cadre with them. They were blowing whistles and directing the enemy soldiers and lift fire, cover fire, and all that, because as they were maneuvering around in the rice paddy, they were doing it by whistle instruction. And I remember at one point I'd gotten to a point where I just couldn't go anymore, and I started realizing subconsciously that every time a certain whistle would blow, they would lift fire, and I would move a little bit. During the time that I was crawling back to try to get back to the graveyard, uh, I don't really know what all happened out there. From time to time, I would find somebody that was dead. Uh, I remember finding someone whose head had been pretty well chopped off by a machete, and I recognized him as one of my very good friends. That before I got married, when we were in Fort Hood, he and I double dated together, and he was a good boy. He was from Oklahoma, and they had just whacked his head mostly off. It was an ugly sight. I'm not 100% sure it was him, but yet I'm sure it was him. There were other men out there that were dying. They were fighting hand-to-hand combat. The second platoon had been totally overwhelmed. Another one of my best friends, and he was involved in hand-to-hand contact, hand-to-hand fighting, and they overwhelmed him. They wounded him, and they stabbed him over and over and over. And one of our lieutenants had been tied up and shot by a North Vietnamese woman soldier, and when she couldn't get it, when she realized that they weren't going to get out, she took his pistol off of him and shot him point blank in the back of the head with his own pistol. And then she was killed by our soldiers holding his pistol. And it was a tragic thing. There was some of our guys that had played dead and managed to live through it. Don Hammett and Graves, Tommy Graves, had seen an opportunity to get up and run, so we could regroup. And while they were doing that, a mortar landed between them, and it just about took off the left cheek of Don Hammett's butt, and it cut Tommy's thigh from his knee to his groin area all the way to the bone. It was a horrible wound, and I remember that when I got back to the graveyard, uh, Martinez was there, and he had his arm propped up on his rifle, and I looked at him, and he had pieces of bone just sticking all out of his arm, and his arm was just mutilated. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he like he was disbelieving it, and he said, "Boy, Don, that sure f's up a good arm." And of course, that's not exactly what he said, but that's the essence of what he said. And I thought, that's something. If it had been me, I'd probably been freaking out. But he was just sitting there calmly, and he said, "Boy, Don, they sure effed up my arm." At one point, when I was crawling along, and these things are probably all mixed up and everything because that's the way the battle was. It was mixed up, and uh, a lot of times I'll remember something that happened to me, and then I'll forget about it. Then later I'll remember something that happened. But I remember as I was crawling along out there, just without any direction, just crawling back and forth. I remember Emil Kettle Hut had rolled over onto the top of a rice dike, and about that time, I saw his hand. He got shot through the hand, and he hollered pretty good. And then about that time, I saw him get shot in the eye and took his eye out. And I thought, well, he's gone. But he made it. He got into the hospital with us, and he lost his eye, but he's fine. And I remember Sheridan was crawling along, and all of a sudden he hollered, and I looked over at him, and his helmet was just flipping straight up into the air, like in slow motion, and it looked like it went 100 yards up into the air. I thought, well, he's dead, and he was in my squad, and he was a good guy, and I mean, one of my best friends. But it didn't do anything to him. Gave him a tremendous headache. It just hit his helmet and knocked it straight up in the air, and did nothing went into his head, and so he made it out of there okay, and. Several other guys, I saw get wounded, and I can't remember some of them is who it was or whatever. But I know that at the end of the day, there were 35 wounded and 19 dead out of two platoons of men, and it was a terrible battle. So many people were in that graveyard, laying there. Some of them unconscious, some of them hurting bad, and I was hurting pretty bad, but my wounds really were superficial comparatively. But I had like I said, I had a tremendous concussion, and so they evacuated us out. We They put us on a Marine evacuation helicopter, one of those banana-looking helicopters, and I remember we took off, and all of a sudden the chopper was took a bunch of hits. They just stitched the chopper with AK-47s, and all these holes just opened up in the chopper, and miraculously nobody got hit. And the chopper set back down real hard on the ground, and then I mean it really revved its engines up, and it took off. And boy, we went straight up then and got out of there and headed over to the field hospital in Da Nang. But I remember Jim Brewer, as he was crawling, before Wendover called him and asked him who was behind him, he told him that he was wounded, and he had been shot in the top of the shoulder, and the bullet had split and went on both sides of his heart, where they're still there today. And it was a real serious wound. He spent several months in the hospital, and they were never able to get the bullets out of his chest. My actually probably best friend I had in Vietnam was a guy named James Locke. We called him Jimmy. He hitchhiked to Yoakum to my home with me on many weekends. We would hitchhike from Fort Hood to Yoakum, and I had a girlfriend back there in Yoakum, and so he'd go home with me, and we'd go to the movies and just kind of hang out. And when we were getting hit the hardest, I remember that he and Martachi, the machine gunner, and he was Martachi's assistant machine gunner. They were uh, they were over in these little bushes to our right, and they were doing a lot of heavy firing and everything. And Martachi told me later that he saw the North Vietnamese firing rockets at two or three of us that were out there, and he kept holding them off with his machine gun. Well, when we got back into the graveyard, right before we got evacuated, Sergeant Bartley came into the graveyard, and he came straight over to me and he said, "Don Lopp's been killed," and it broke my heart. It just really broke my heart. He was such a good guy. He stuttered a lot. Uh, he was he was a smart guy. I remember he and I had hitchhiked home one weekend, and we were hitchhiking through Luling, Texas, and these girls kept riding past us. And finally, they turned around and stopped, and I had just gotten married, and Lop ended up writing one of the girls that had stopped and talked to us, and I had to write her and tell her that he had been killed, and I really got a really emotional but heartfelt letter back from her, and that was my biggest heartache ever in the service. Lop was a wonderful kid. I don't remember much about landing at Da Nang. I just remember I was what you call walking wounded, ambulatory, and I remember that I helped somebody off the chopper, and I was helping them hop into the to the little. It was a pretty big tent hospital, just a station, and they had all of these bunks in there, and every one of them were full. And I remember I helped somebody in, and the corpsman grabbed the person I was helping. I don't even remember who it is now. I was just too far out of it. And they grabbed him and put him on a gurney, a little jungle cot there, and put an IV in him. And they just kind of forgot about me. And I remember standing there leaning against his tent pole, and I think the full impact of what happened hit me. It impacted me. I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I remember I started just to cry, and I was missing Lop, and about that time, this doctor looked up and he saw me standing there squalling, and I was just leaning against his tent post. And of course, I was bloody from head to toe. And I remember him saying, "Somebody grab that man." Of course, he deleted expletives, and I don't remember anything else until I got out to the hospital ship. But somebody grabbed me and put me down and put an IV in me. Sometime that late that evening, late that afternoon, we were put on a helicopter and taken out to the USS Sanctuary hospital ship off the coast of Dong Ha, which is north of Da Nang. And I remember waking up, getting off the chopper, and they put us in this little, like a hallway they call triage. And I remember thinking I was in pretty bad shape. I felt, I was exhausted. We hadn't had any sleep in 2 nights, and just totally exhausted. I'd crawled through 400 meters of sloppy rice paddy with all my equipment on, and pulling a wounded man. And all of a sudden, another chopper came in behind us, and I was laying on a little pallet on the floor in this triage section, and it was a chopper full of Marines from Quezon, and they had been under siege for, like I said before, for a couple of months. The guys' clothes were rotting off of them. They were so wounded, it was horrible. So one kid came in, and his eyeballs looked like grape jelly, just stuck in the sockets of his head. Looked like they just blobbed jelly in his eyes, and it was his eyeballs. And one kid came in, and both of his legs and both of his arms were broken and shot up. One guy he must have had 500 little holes all in him. He was still alive, had several of his fingers missing, and next thing you knew, I was sitting up on the cot, and then pretty soon I was sitting up smoking a cigarette, thinking, I'm not bad at all. Uh, these poor guys from Quezon, they were mangled. It's unbelievable. I don't even know how to describe it. Uh, the feeling that I had laying there, knowing I was hurt, but knowing I was blessed so much, and it was really a sad day. A couple of days after I got on the hospital ship, um, none of the shrapnel that I had went through my skull and entered my brain. I was very lucky. I have a piece right in the center of my forehead, which is a sliver of that bullet. But I had a horn on the front of my head about that long. It just made a perfect little cone, and they couldn't figure out why it lasted so long. So I was on the ship almost a month before that went down. But one day, a couple of days after I got hit, the doctor decided he needed to take some shrapnel out of this part of my head. But so they didn't have hardly any supplies left on the ship because Quezon was just draining them. and they had hardly any local deadening, Novocaine or anything like that. So he gave me one shot of Novocaine, then he cut me open. And immediately the blood just gushed out. Well, that washed most of that Novocaine out, so he just kept cutting. And he was trying to, and he did dig one piece of shrapnel out, but I have several pieces bedded under a network of nerves that goes across your forehead here. And by that time, all the deadening had washed out of my head, and he just didn't have any more that they could spare for something like that. So he told me, he said, I'm going to have to sew you back up. He said, I can't operate on you. You're too tense. And I was tearing the sheets off that bed and off that little operation table. And so he put, I think, 10 stitches in my head without a lick of deadening. And I don't want that to ever happen again. And he sewed me back up. But I still have trouble with that. I can just tap my head right here, and it shoots pains all down through my jaw and sometimes down to my hand right here.
Thank you for sharing your memories of the battle with us. After all these years since the war, how do you feel about the men that you served with?
You know, the A Company, First of the Sixth, the original gunfighters, probably one of the best bunch of guys I've ever known in my life. They came from all over the United States. Madison was from California, and Metz was from New Jersey. Several guys from New York, from Wyoming, from Wisconsin, from Texas, Louisiana, from all over the United States. And yet, it's amazing how we all fit together, different yet so much alike. And to this day, 2007, we still meet and we still have so much in common. And like the movie says, we're truly a band of brothers. And we've bled together. I remember at one point, most of us had dysentery, and we had to kind of tend to each other, and it was nothing but a mess. It's horrible. Uh, we got in fights with each other in base camps and even sometimes in the field, but yet we would die for each other. We were willing that day to, we'd made up our mind we were going to stay with the wounded man and die with him because we were getting overrun and we just weren't going to leave him to die by himself. And I'm not saying that like, hey, we're heroes. I'm saying that because we loved each other and we cared about each other. And that's what family does, and that's what we were. We were the gunfighter A Company family. And Captain Brennan was like our dad. And our squad leaders were like our big uncles. And it was amazing. And like I said, we get together still once a year, and all of our wives come and they get together. They fit together just like family. It's really a unique company. I feel like different than any company, and we seem to have a closeness that the other companies didn't have. Therefore, they called on us to do things a lot of times instead of the other companies.